It has been more than a year since Dorian Concept released Tide, right? There's no way dark fantasy is still big. Oh boy. Alright, let's do this one more time. The appeal of dark fantasy boils down to one idea: masterpieces of film imagery like Legend 1985. When we see the resting knight, we see ourselves. Which leaves us with one question: what really is dark fantasy? Whoa! A dedicated face cam, huh? What happened to the disembodied voice playing throughout the video? Oh, it's a new format, you know. I spent way too much time making the last couple of videos only for them to flop, so I'm really trying not to burn out before I make it on this channel, you know? Lazy Asian. Never thought I'd see the day. Huh? What'd I do to you? No, don't just walk away from that. Come back here. Rude? What is dark fantasy? So for new viewers of the channel, dark fantasy is categorized by Wikipedia as a subgenre of fantasy that combines horror elements with various fantasy formulas. What I didn't realize at the time of making the last video, however, was how expansive this definition actually is. Dark fantasy includes a wide spectrum of media, from the most recent masterpieces like Dark Souls, Elden Ring, Game of Thrones, and of course Berserk, all the way to children's literature, 80s dark fantasy films, and good old classic novels. Since there's such a dizzying amount of subjects under dark fantasy, I want to pick up where I left off in the previous video and do a better job explaining why this makes me feel this. This feeling. What is this feeling? Is the question all commenters share in these videos. Why do I have this vague memory of an experience I've never had, they ask. Why do these paths feel familiar despite knowing I've never walked it? Why can I recall the cold midnight breeze on my skin, yet never set foot on this beach before? Why do I understand how this night feels despite never being in this situation in my life? This phenomenon is called Anemoia, a wistful affection for a time or place one has never known. Aside from the dark fantasy trend, you've most likely already encountered this feeling from other trends in the past. For example, Fruitiger Arrow, with its watery, bubbly aesthetic symbolizing people's optimism in the early 2000s. Or maybe even Dreamcore, which brings to life weird and obscure dreamscapes we can vaguely recall, but can't quite remember from where. While differing in genres, they all touch on the same feeling: that you've seen this before, but you're wholly unfamiliar with it. This can actually be explained by a psychological phenomenon that specifically happens while recalling memories. Dude, I swear I am not about to go on some unrelated rant like I did in the last video. There's actually a point. All right, hold on. I gotta find a place to put this down on, man. My arm is getting tired. There you go. Most people believe that the process of remembering is a lot like replaying a videotape. When you first record something, the image is the clearest it will ever be because it's a fresh recording. Oh, I remember the answer to this part of the exam because I just read that yesterday. Boom, easy. But over time, as the film degrades, the image also suffers. Likewise, the less frequently you recall a memory, the more fragmented it becomes in your mind until it becomes completely unrecognizable. For Professor of Philosophy Philippe de Brigard, this is a fundamentally flawed way of viewing how we recall memories. In his article Nostalgia Reimagined, Brigard proposes that memories are actually simulations of past events, rather than a review of a recording. Although memory and imagination are usually thought of as different, a number of critical findings in the past 3 decades have challenged this view. The psychologist Endel Tulving suggests that remembering the past and imagining the future were 2 processes of a single system for mental time travel, called the default network. But in the past decade, it has become clear that the brain's default network supports mental simulations of other hypothetical events too, such as episodes that could have occurred in one's past but didn't, atemporal routine activities like brushing your teeth, mind wandering, spatial navigation, imagining other people's thoughts, and narrative comprehension, among others. So to dumb this down a shade for cave people like me, the idea is that the brain was thought to only be in charge of 2 functions. Number 1, recalling past events, and number 2, imagining future ones. They named the system that overlooks this process the default network. However, recent studies show that the default network actually governs a 3rd function, which is simulations of hypothetical events. For example, you've most likely had times where you've walked into a room and you're hit with that feeling of deja vu. You know you've never been there before, but there's this tickling sensation inside your brain that kind of tells you that you have. Well, Brigard proposes that the brain can actually simulate the feeling of being in that room before if that's a place you likely would have gone to in the past. If this is true, that means the brain is capable of reconstructing memories without accessing prior experiences, which has a bunch of implications. Number one, your memories are never true representations of what actually happened. Number two, your memories are mere reconstructions of past events from your perspective. And number three, you don't need to actually be in certain places before for your brain to connect it to some imagined memory. A memory of an experience you've never had. Okay, great. So now we understand the mechanics of Anemoia and why dark fantasy TikToks trigger these feelings. Video over, you can click off now. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.
Ooh, I love my wife. I love my wife. Ah! Let's go ride a bike with my wife. Ah!
Except that's just not enough though, is it? If you're like me, you understand that there's more to this than just the cold mechanistic processes of the brain. For example, we understand that video games really only use a bunch of ones and zeros to get a certain output. But our actual experience of the game itself is so much more than the sum of its parts. That's the good stuff. Likewise, this dark fantasy trend leaves a sour taste in people's mouths because of its use of AI. And I happen to be one of those people. Yeah, that's right. I didn't make this clear in the last video, and y'all shit on me for this. So I'm gonna make this clear today. I don't like AI stealing other people's hard work. I hate what it represents, and I don't think we're being cautious enough of its true destructive potential. Period, hard stop, there's no debating that.
Wait, you're right. Wait, why does he have two clip-on mics? One for backup, maybe? Wait.
And that's exactly where my issue is. Despite knowing this, the look still captivates me. I can't help but wonder how cool the air would feel in my skin as I walk through these dark landscapes, how heavy my boots would be filled with sand as I walk through this beach at dusk, how the water splishes and splashes against my boat as I float into the castle grounds. I know it's AI, but I can't look away. The worst part is the better AI gets, the better these look. There's going to be a point where people won't be able to tell if it's AI anymore, and they'll slowly forget where this look comes from. So, because I don't want to come off as if I'm promoting AI thievery again, I instead want to focus on its building blocks, the real dark fantasy. Starting with, I identified two major visual elements that all dark fantasy TikToks share. Number one, the look. And number two, a knight in shining armor or adjacent. We'll come back to this in a bit. As I said in the last video, the dark fantasy look came from the use of 80s movies as lab rats for AI. Unfortunately though, I don't think I did a good enough job of explaining why they used 80s movies in the first place. The example I used was this scene in The Return of the Jedi where Obi-Wan reveals the truth about Luke's father. But if you listen closely, Obi-Wan seems to be lost in the sauce, as the kids would put it.
Luke, did I ever tell you about Ahsoka Tano? She was your father's exotic teenage alien apprentice. A fine piece of
All right, cut it. I don't want to get restricted again, please. In case you weren't there for it, this video is based on the audio version which Moist Critical covered in his video, This Technology Will Scare You. This is one of the first videos that showcased how advanced AI audio synthesis had become, and this coverage garnered enough attention to kickstart the whole AI dark fantasy craze. But this begs the question, why choose this look for dark fantasy? Why not use a clean corporate look like a Kia commercial, or masterpieces of film imagery like a Minecraft movie 2025? I mean, after all, they generated hundreds of millions of dollars for shareholders, so people are clearly moved by them, right? Right? The thing is, much like everything in life, money is not the end-all be-all. These depictions of the world are colorful and realistic, and they've made hundreds of millions of dollars, but they're missing one key characteristic: a soul. They're clean, but they're almost too clean. They're realistic, but what message are they ultimately trying to say? Buy our cars, chicken jockey, Jack Black is Steve, my name is Steve. They're all just safe for corporate visuals intended for profit. When we look at films like Labyrinth, there's always that painted look. From the way they light the subjects, I hope I'm properly highlighting the way they light the subjects right now, to the saturation of the colors, the richness of its shadows, and the slightest hint of texture all over the screen. Furthermore, the sets, costumes, and props just look more full and weighty, like you could swing it at somebody and knock them out. Looking back on it, I realized this look was the direct result of limitations on film technology at the time. Matter of fact, the owl that you see in the opening of Labyrinth was actually one of the most advanced 3D renders of an animal in cinema history. Here's what it looks like. To my younger watchers, this probably looks like some 3D animation student's project they got an F on. But at the time, this was the peak of technological prowess, and people reacted to it the same way that we did with the first Spider-Verse movie.
My name is Miles Morales. I was bitten by a radioactive
Oh yeah, that's pretty
For the
cool.
last year and 4 months, I've been booking
Why is he black?
Given this context, the most reliable way to make their graphics, therefore, was by hand. Costumes, characters, puppets, animatronics, entire sets were built from the ground up by hand. And the best example of this can be found in the cult classic Legend 1985. In Legend, they went to 4 different locations in the US and the UK, and they constructed a total of 10 diverse settings which the characters explored throughout the story. More specifically, there's the Radiant Forest, which is clearly inspired by retro Disney movies like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. On the other hand, there's the villain's dark castle sitting off in the distance, which again pulls inspiration from stories like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. When you see these vast sets and you notice how there always seems to be something moving, it wasn't by accident. There are people behind giant fans who specifically point them in such a way to make the plants move exactly like that. Sometimes you can even tell there are literally people making the plants move by hand. In the ending scene, the hero and the princess watch the unicorns reunite from a couple of tree branches, right? But for my eagle-eyed viewers, they'll notice that the costume designers intentionally gorilla glued their hair down just in time before an F5 hurricane strikes the studio. I'm definitely not lying, this actually happened. I don't think I gotta tell you, but clearly this sequence was only possible because some intern behind the camera put his or her blood, sweat, and tears into this performance. Furthermore, this scene in the evil castle where Mia's character runs through a bunch of pillars most likely required hundreds of hours of work to set up. From building the pillars themselves, to getting bright enough lights to light the scene, to getting powerful enough fog machines to create this atmosphere, not to mention the time needed to get the actresses in costume, checking for exposure, redoing the shots, all for a 42-second sequence. But my goodness, does it pay off. Thanks to all their effort, we end up with these 2 surreal settings that allow its viewers to truly get lost in its dense forestry and cold stone walls. A reminder that all of this took up physical space and was there in person. Matter of fact, I'm touching it right now. Yet, all of this would be for naught if it wasn't for the look itself. They shot Legend on a 35mm Fuji A250T negative, which may not be a noteworthy film stock. I personally think the images out of them definitely fit that 80s look, but it is still worth mentioning because of the mindset it puts filmmakers in. Shooting on film means whatever they shot stays that way. If they used the wrong temperature of light or the costumes didn't behave the way they wanted, they either had to reshoot everything or keep it in film. Yet, with proper exposure, set decoration, and phenomenal costume design, they brought to life this impossible world where bright and colorful forests straight out of a Disney film can coexist with cold, desolate death bogs, treasury rooms brimming with glitter and gold, and an imposing evil lord's castle sitting off in the distance, which looks awfully familiar, doesn't it? The 1980s was a time where films were defined by the limits of their technology. I think nowadays we sometimes forget that we live in a time filmmakers back then would have killed for. Today, a style is mostly a creative choice. If, say, you wanted to recreate the GTA 6 trailer in full Lego animation, well, there's this 15-year-old kid who's doing exactly that. Back then, choosing a style was more of a necessity because it was heavily influenced by the resources they had access to. Today's small filmmakers will get exactly where I'm coming from. When you're put in this position where you have to scrape the bottom of the barrel just to tell your story, you're essentially forced to maximize the amount of creative use that you get out of the resources that you have. And this is the exact type of behavior that we see in these 80s dark fantasy movies, but scaled up. Despite these limitations, scratch that, because of these limitations, filmmakers were forced to think outside of the box, and their solution to the scarcity problem was the 80s dark fantasy look. The reason why cult classics like Legend stands out and the Minecraft movie does not is because the style was born purely out of resourcefulness. With a mind-boggling budget of $150 million, director Jared Hess reached a point where his issue was now of abundance, not scarcity. With $150 million, the scope of the project can be as big as the director wants. However, with this kind of money, there is always a price. It took 11 years to make a Minecraft movie, with 4 different directors passing on the mantle before getting to Jared Hess. And the entire time, Warner Brothers hasn't seen a single cent from their investment. On top of all that, Mojang, as the creators of Minecraft, naturally have a say in what kind of film gets made from their IP. So when you have all of these stakeholders to account for, how do you even begin to appease all of them? Simple. You make a safe, company-friendly movie that makes them money. That's it. In contrast, Legend encountered no such issues. According to this documentary recounting the production process, they actually got greenlit on the first script they wrote.
I loved it. I loved it. It was like a green light on first script. Oh, it was beautiful.
Likewise, there were no changes in directors over the 4-year span it took to make this film. This means that the movie was strictly made under Ridley Scott's original vision, a dark fantasy ripped out of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. This is why we get these adult themes and bold costumes that would be way out of place in a Disney film. An 8-foot-tall demon that is symbolic of the Antichrist and makes the female protagonist wear this risque shadow garb is wildly inappropriate for a children's movie. But understanding that, Ridley Scott does it anyways. Why? Because this was a statement. This was Ridley Scott's way of saying, this is not a Disney film, this is something original from me. When all of these elements line up just right, a driven director set on bringing to life an original take on the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, a team of artists who understand the limits of their technology, and just the right kind of film stock to bring it all together, we end up with the 1980s dark fantasy magic. However, this analysis isn't quite complete yet. The last element in every dark fantasy TikTok is the knight in shining armor or adjacent. More specifically, there seems to be a heavy bias towards knights sitting or lying down on the ground. Now, while there's no direct explanation for why this is, it is still important to bring up because the frequency of this characteristic is not a coincidence. For example, let's look at this clip from the Elder Scrolls High Isle trailer. So for those who haven't seen this trailer, who do you think is the main character? Well, this should be an easy question. Clearly, this trailer is about a knight at the cusp of victory. All he has left to do is to kill off a couple of minions and then face off against the final boss in an epic duel. Oh, and wouldn't you know it, after serving an absolute beatdown for 60% of the trailer, the knight does exactly what we expected him to do from the very beginning. Our valiant knight dies. He wasn't the main character after all. However, despite his loss and a total screen time of only 1 minute and 46 seconds, the audience quickly fell in love with this unknown knight. This is significant because in these games, faceless knights were usually NPCs, no more important than a giant meat punching bag. Yet, for a solid 60 seconds, this dude was a walking army on 2 legs. Not a single movement was unaccounted for. He had an answer to each and every one of their feeble attacks. He displayed unparalleled strength, waving around this giant sword like a feather, and he had a deep well of combat knowledge to adapt to any situation. The dude countered a spell with his hands. With his hands! The reason why this defeat didn't feel like a loss is because we understood the knight was fighting against insurmountable odds. His death wasn't really a waste of sorts, it was more like a final moment of rest for a man who fought until the very end. This sentiment doesn't stop at Western media either. We can actually find this struggling knight in every culture of the world. The best example of this is the poster boy of dark fantasy himself, literally called the Struggler. So for those who aren't familiar with Berserk, Guts is a controversial figure as an anti-hero. Despite being the knight in shining armor of the series, he's most famously depicted not embodying the knightly values. Here I show you 2 images of 2 characters in the series who play a prominent role in the story. One is a man with long, flowing silver hair donning elegant plated armor. He is goal-driven, kind, empathetic, and a strong leader who led thousands of his soldiers into numerous victories on the battlefield. The other is fucking a demon, before shoving his one-armed cannon into its mouth and blowing its brains out. Now, believe it or not, the demon spawn isn't the guy balls deep in Pennywise. It's actually the former who sacrifices thousands of his friends to become a god. What a silly guy, am I right? Come on, look at this guy. Oh no, Griffith, you can't do that. You gotta ask for consent. To make a long story short, this guy right here is enduring a perpetual Monday. If he is not running, he's fighting. What is he fighting? Demonkind. Why do they keep fighting? He has this mark on his neck that is essentially a giant Minecraft beacon for demonkind. Yet, despite his challenges, he always makes the best of his situation. Miura makes a point to include these images of Guts resting throughout Berserk. And through these panels, Miura recounts Guts' entire story by simple show, not tell. In the prologue, Guts starts off as a young man grasping tightly onto his sword like a child would with its teddy bear. He seems to be staring past the wall in front of him, thinking deeply about a future yet to come. Fast forward a couple of years, and we see Guts grow into a fine young man. Now standing, he still holds his sword close but is more lax with it, opting to instead close his eyes and focus on recuperating in the moment. Not long after that, Guts now dons a long, flowing black cape, draping over his person as if darkness itself consumed him. You'll notice he no longer clutches his sword. Rather, he sets it aside, clearly unconcerned due to the tonnage it now possesses. Finally, in the last image of the resting Guts, the sword is no longer in frame. He also does away with his black cloak and armor, choosing to brandish his years of trauma instead. His missing arm and abundance of scars seem to be a mere afterthought, as he once again stares past the wall in front of him, thinking deeply about a future yet to come. In this way, Guts' struggle speaks to the average man. Due to the way society is structured, most men are expected to bear the pain of life without being taught how to handle it. Some of us are lucky and have father figures who can guide us, but others only have characters like Guts to turn to in times of need. These depictions of a crestfallen knight resting peacefully on the ground is a callback to characters like Guts. When we see the resting knight, we see more than just a tired man. We see ourselves. We see the battles he endures on a daily basis that the world couldn't care any less about. He may wish in the deepest depths of his soul for a shortcut, to end the suffering once and for all. But unlike Griffith, all he will ever get is a brief moment of reprieve before waking up and doing it all over again. The appeal of dark fantasy boils down to one idea: the desire to live better lives. In my previous video, I explained dark fantasy as a form of escape from the lives that we live, but I was sorely mistaken. What we really imagine when we see these fantastical landscapes is the moment in our lives when the struggle finally ends. We get that sense of Anemoia because we've yet to experience that point in our lives. Therefore, our brain simulates how it must feel when we finally achieve financial stability, how it must feel to welcome that whimsy and wonder from our childhood back into our lives. Likewise, the reason why we associate this feeling with the 80s dark fantasy look is because it represents the authenticity we crave in our lives. For a lot of us, our jobs are just a means to an end. We lie to our true desires every day we clock into work because we understand this is a necessary sacrifice in order to care for the ones we love. Lastly, we gravitate towards this image of a resting night because it is a reflection of ourselves at the end of each and every day, lying down in solemn thought, asking one question: when will I finally be free?